Having the skills, the knowledge and the instinct to select a good campsite can really make the difference between a miserable trip and a really life-changing experience. So in this video, I want to share 3 of the things that I look for when I'm considering setting up camp. And some of these tips might surprise you because there's a lot more to a good, safe campsite than just a water source and some flat ground in the mountains. Now, in order to keep this video short and sweet, I'm going to be talking about a specific environment, so high alpine environments. Areas that are categorized by high mountains, deep valleys, pine forests, think Sierras, think the Alps, or my personal favorite, the Pyrenees. So keep in mind that this advice is specific to high mountain areas and is not necessarily going to be applicable for deserts or plains, or even places like eucalypt forest in Australia where I grew up. This advice could actually be pretty dangerous. So this is just about alpine areas. All right, so my first tip is to avoid very high altitude and very low altitude areas. And altitude is really one of the most important things you want to keep in mind when you're setting up a campsite. And the reason why I say you want to avoid the high areas, well, that's fairly obvious. That's going to be more exposed, it's going to be colder, so you're much more likely to be kept awake by very strong gusts of wind and your tent rattling all night if you're in a really exposed ridge or high up on a mountain somewhere. All right, so that's a fairly obvious one, but let's look at the other side of the spectrum, and this is something that you may not be aware of. So I try my best to avoid sleeping at the very bottom of valleys for the following reasons. So cold air will condense overnight and collect in that valley, meaning it's going to be colder overnight. And then also it's more humid at the bottom of these valleys, meaning that you're very likely to wake up with a heavy dew in the morning, and waking up with a wet tent is something you can avoid if you camp around that mid-mountain area. So really what I'm looking for is to camp somewhere in between the very bottom of the valley and the very top of the ridges and high mountains. And the ideal thing would be to find some kind of flat area that's around that mid-altitude. And that way I'm going to be avoiding the exposure up top, and I'm going to be avoiding that cold condensed air at the very bottom of the valley. So I think really the perfect situation is finding a small alpine meadow or maybe a flat forested area that is just nestled into the side of a mountain, and that's flat enough for you to put a tent up. And it doesn't have to be a very large area, it only needs to be flat enough just for your one little tent. Okay, my second tip is to avoid camping directly nearby water sources, and that might surprise some of you because water is really one of the top 3 things people are always looking for. And whilst it's nice to have water close by for both practical and aesthetic reasons, having water close by brings with it some unnecessary implications. First of all, you have bugs and lots of other animal life. In the past, whenever I've camped near a water source, there is almost always a lot more animal activity through the night. Nocturnal animals tend to come down to the water to drink, to bathe, to socialize, and they bring with them a lot of noise and activity and things likely to keep you up at night. Nothing worse than being in a tent and hearing some strange noise that you have no idea, even if it is something as placid and gentle as a deer. The other reason I tend not to camp directly near water is because I choose to go with a single walled tent that has no fly barrier, meaning that it's essentially open air. I just have the tarp over the top of me and a Tyvek floor, and so it's very easy for bugs to get into my tent. And for that reason, I have to be very careful about where I set up. As you probably know, mosquitoes need water to survive, so if you're camping nearby water, you're much more likely to be bothered by mosquitoes. Now you might be thinking, well, how do you collect water for your camp to clean and cook and wash up? Well, when I go multi-day hiking, I tend to bring a capacity of 3 to 4 litres. So I just bring 2 2-litre plastic bottles, and around an hour before I start looking for a camp, I'll make sure that I've filled that capacity. So I'm walking around with 4 litres of water, and that means I've got the freedom to set up absolutely anywhere. I find that 4 litres of water, when I fill up in a stream, by the time I set up camp, I've usually got 3.5, and that is more than enough to allow me to cook, to clean up in the morning, and then cook breakfast in the morning if I choose to, and then plenty of drinking water as well. And that means I don't need to camp directly near a water source. I'm not tied to that, and that gives me a lot more freedom in where I choose to camp. The other thing that I want to point out is that camping near a water source is the common sense and popular thing to do, meaning that you're much more likely to find other people camping there. And if you're anything like me, I like going out alone, or at least I like being quiet when I'm out in the wilderness. Like, there is no one here for miles and miles and miles in every single direction. Having the ability to camp wherever I want results in a much more tranquil peaceful night with less people around. The third thing I look for in a campsite is good forest coverage, both above and below. So this goes against one thing that people commonly look for when they're after a campsite, and that is wide open plains and meadows and lots of space around them. And I think there's a bit of human instinct involved in that. It really taps into our sense of safety when we can see potential threats coming. But in most situations, you don't need to have that. So for that reason, I tend to seek out a less obvious campsite. Now this might be on the edge of a clearing or a couple of meters into a forest, anywhere that's going to provide a little bit more protection from the wind and from the cold, and a place that's less obvious to other people that might be camping there. Like I mentioned earlier, this is generally around that mid-mountain level, somewhere that's away from water source, but also fairly protected. So the forest provides a little bit of extra protection. It forms a barrier for wind, but it also traps in a little bit more of that warm air. So having a canopy above is going to keep you a little bit warmer. But the main reason that camping in a forest is warmer is because you have foliage underneath. So I tend to sleep with a really thin mat, and I find that having some leaf foliage or some pine needles or any deciduous matter that's fallen on the ground is going to just elevate me off the ground a little bit, and it's going to provide a natural insulative layer, meaning that I can carry a light pack with a very minimal mattress, and I can get away with having a warm night's sleep because I've got a little bit of that extra coverage underneath. The only caveat to that I should mention is that in some particular types of forests, particularly in eucalypt forests, if there is really high wind and large branches that can potentially be dislodged by wind, this can make certain forests an absolute death trap. In Australia, we call them widow makers because they literally pierce tents. So if you don't want to be impaled by a eucalypt branch in Australia, then I would avoid camping in eucalypt forests and high winds. So they're my three major tips or things I look for in a campsite. But there's one more thing I really want to touch on, but it's something that I can't teach you, and that's intuition. I think it's really useful to take 5 or 10 minutes and sit in a potential campsite and just feel what's going on. Have a look around you, listen to the wind, pay attention to what your senses pick up, but also pay attention to your gut, because sometimes that will tell you the most important things. Sitting somewhere for 5 or 10 minutes and just observing what you see is going to give you a lot of information, and maybe not all of it will be processed mentally, but a lot of it will be processed by your body. If you feel comfortable in a location after 5 or 10 minutes, it's a pretty good sign. But if you spend 5 or 10 minutes in what appears at first to be a really safe, protected location, and you get a big gust of wind, and you realize this whole place is just a big wind vortex because of the cirque of mountains around you, you've picked up information there that you can use to help keep you safe and give you the best night's sleep possible. Keep in mind, you don't have to take any of this as gospel. Of course, sometimes I camp by water, sometimes I camp in open fields, especially when I'm with other people and they like doing that. But the main thing is, I want you to get out and make mistakes. And that's how I learned, from going out and just messing things up and taking note of the lessons that I learned. Don't let any of this stop you from doing what you love. If you like camping near water, if you like camping in open fields, absolutely go for it. It's just what I tend to do based on the equipment that I have and the areas that I tend to go. Start building your confidence and experience by making a few mistakes. That's how I did it. I'll see you on the summit.